Hello, everyone. So we're here again to talk about Uranus in the second house or Taurus. So we have a good handful of charts to explore with you. We want to start by just grounding in the second house Uranus and Taurus archetype, and then to also speak about the current transit of Uranus in Taurus, which is happening for several years. This is being recorded in the year of 2022, which is also the year where Uranus will join the North Node in Taurus. So this particular class on Uranus in Taurus is really relevant to this particular year since it's on the North Node. So we'll define the second house Taurus archetype in general first. This archetype corresponds to survival. It corresponds to the senses, and the senses correspond to survival in the sense that the senses are what enables us to gauge our physical experience. So we know if something is pleasurable, we know if something is painful. It enables us to say, okay, stay away from that. That's death, that's danger. Move towards here, that's comfort. And comfort, in a way, you can equate comfort with stability, with survival. It means I'm in a body. I can be here. There's safety here. On the most gross level of consciousness, Taurus second house speaks to the basic necessity of the soul on its evolutionary journey to be here and to want to be here. So we need to have a biological instinct to survive. So we're all geared on the very basic level to survive: food, water, shelter, procreation. That enables any species to continue to survive and exist, which on a soul level enables for the continuance of incarnation, we can say. The reality of physical experience and the perpetuation of physical experience enables us to feel like I'm here, I want to be here, I value being here. If we didn't value being here, we wouldn't care about sustaining the body. We wouldn't care about getting our needs met. And so what happens in the Taurus second house archetype, we're becoming aware of our own personal, physical, human life from the perspective of what do I value? What makes my life livable, right? So it's not just basic survival needs. There's a deeper quality to second house Taurus, which roots from a deep sense of self-value and self-worth, self-esteem. It's not just I'm surviving, but I have an internal connection to the value and meaning of my own life that makes it right for me to be here. And thus there's a way to live that reflects the values that I hold. And thus it makes my life feel good. It makes my life feel livable. And we all have different values, and these reflect our own sense of need, what we need to feel grounded, what we need to feel like we're here in a way that feels livable and good for each one of us. And so the Taurus second house archetype corresponds to internalization. We have to know ourselves. There's an immense amount of self-knowledge, self-intimacy, potentially a deep ground of security within oneself that is or can be developed in the Taurus second house archetype, because we get to know ourselves. I mean, there's something very interesting about, to use the idea of taste as an example, right? You're gonna eat something and you'll say, oh, I really like this. And you're going to develop a certain aesthetic for certain tastes. And you'll want to buy food and cook in a certain way and put things together. And you're going to design your kitchen in a way that reflects the aesthetics or the way in which you want to feel. There are certain colors and sounds and songs and clothing that are all going to elicit certain feelings or responses and scents. It's so nuanced. And as we get to know ourselves, we really develop our flavor, our way of being. And it's sensual. And the senses really correspond to what we are going to hear, what we're going to see, what we're going to smell, what we're going to taste, how we're going to feel. And we're really creating an environment around ourselves physically, kinesthetically, that reflects our inner value system. So in a very positive way, second house Taurus says, I value myself, I value my life, I have a graceful embodied relationship to being, on this particular talk. I just felt to wear a white and a scarf, and I don't wear this kind of clothing very often, and I'm like, oof, I like the way it feels, the way it looks. And so second house is artistic, not fifth house Leo artistic, which is about overt creative actualization. It's artistic in the sense that it's artsy, it's graceful, it's beautiful. Survival isn't like this black and white, put food in your vein through a cord, through a needle. It's more like the way in which we're living itself is an expression of embodiment. Gracefulness relates to a felt sense of what it's like to be here. And so it's never just about food, water, shelter. It's the full sensory experience that we're feeling to have. And this is beauty. It's beauty. It's grace. It's the ability to feel. And one more thing that I would say about this is, on a more gross level of consciousness, we can have just the general, I always want to feel good and I never want to feel bad. And so there can be a sort of laziness in the Taurus second house archetype of gravitating towards pleasure or the resources that one is familiar with. I always want to feel this way, or I don't want to put any effort towards my own survival or my own life. So I'm going to just depend on the world as it is. This is where I get my food. This is where I get my pleasure. This is how I ground out, let's say in front of the television with chips. Or this is my relationship to my sexuality. And while pleasure and comfort are beautiful expressions of this archetype and kind of necessary for this human experience, it can also become a trap of indulgence or laziness where we're identified with pleasure, with feeling good, and it becomes a non-growth situation. It becomes a state of stagnancy. And that's where that Scorpio 8th house polarity is so essential, because energy needs to circulate. So I always think of Taoism or a Taoist culture when I think of Taurus second house, because there's something very simple, full and rich and full of life and chi, but simple. It's not cluttered. And that's sort of an ideal within Taurus where we can feel life in the present moment because we're present with sensory experience, like drinking a cup of tea or looking at a beautiful tree or feeling sensation, even feeling pain. If you really go deeper into some of the deeper Taurus teachings, there's this interesting line between comfort and discomfort, and really has so much to do with our capacity to allow and to feel and to embody. So there's so much wisdom in the teachings of embodiment when it comes to Taurus, where we feel more, experience more, and really feel more life as we become simpler and develop a greater capacity to experience the present moment. Anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, definitely. I think out of all of the signs that we're going to be exploring this year, this is probably going to be one of the biggest because Uranus is transiting through Taurus for all of us. So we are going to be talking about different souls who have Uranus in the second or Uranus in Taurus. That is a generational time. But we all have Uranus transiting through Taurus somewhere in our chart. And so it is about all those things that hold earthly meaning to us. What feels good on earth is Taurus. It's ruled by Venus, and that's the inner side of Venus. So what feels good to me, what feels good to you, it's very personal. And what holds meaning for us evolves over time. And that's what we've experienced in the last year with Uranus squaring Taurus. Uranus squaring Saturn. Uranus and Taurus squaring Saturn in Aquarius, right? So Uranus rules the sign of Aquarius. And so things are changing in terms of what holds meaning and value to you. And so what holds meaning on earth, or what feels good on earth to us, is everything you said, Ari. Anything that fulfills the senses, whether it's a beautiful song or music. You think about music being a universal language. We all love music in one way or another. I don't know anyone, I've never met anyone who doesn't love music of some kind. And it is a way of feeling connected to something larger than ourselves. In evolutionary astrology, we talk about the Taurus archetype as being the frog in the well, and not only being able to see its version of the sky, and through polarity needing to bust out of that well. And yet there's a fear around that. There's a fear of the unknown. There's a fear of becoming powerless or insecure, and yet it's necessary. And so there's a lot of changing circumstances that we're experiencing, maybe forced upon us with this archetype through transit. We've all experienced 3 passes last year. There'll be another strong one this summer, as you mentioned, Ari, as transiting Uranus conjuncts the transiting North Node, which is our destiny. And then in the fall, Uranus and Saturn will square again. So it is a time where our values are changing, and because there's a transformation that's occurring for the planet, for ourselves personally as well. And one way that I like to look at the second house and Venus and Taurus archetype, the need to really cultivate an inner relationship to yourself, to ground yourself in who you are. And through that natural sextile to the 12th house, Neptune, Pisces, there's a natural sextile there. The inner door is always open. So if you find yourself feeling like, I need more, there's got to be more than this, you will not find that more out there. Not very easily will you, but you will always find everything you need in here or through that inner door. So there's a reason that the second house and the 12th house are intimately connected in this way with an effortless ease. We are all hardwired to have a higher, greater experience, Neptune being the higher octave of that Venus. And so while it's important to ground yourself on Earth and to make sure that you can supply yourself with your essential needs, there's an even greater pull through that sextile to a search for ultimate meaning, not just earthly meaning. So there's a dance that always goes on. And if you feel like, if you are asking yourself the question, is this all there is? I would encourage you to turn in, to continue to walk through the door. Venus has been retrograde, or was retrograde, from December 18th through the end of January. We're still in the shadow until early March. And so everybody is still in the process of reevaluation and thinking about, how do I want to spend my time? What is this next chapter of my life about? So allow yourself the downtime, allow yourself to slow down still and try some of the things you've been thinking about in the last several weeks. You know, try them out before you just throw them out into the wind and see what happens. And so Taurus is also about plotting and going more consciously, step by step, slow, not this fast moving archetype. So I'm looking forward to sharing more about how this manifests in people's charts. And one thing to remember too is every archetype has a light and a shadow. And so we'll discuss just the beautiful things about it, Uranus and Taurus, and then the most challenging things that we can experience as well.
Beautiful. And hopefully we'll get a chance to drop into the actual North Node Taurus conjunction maybe towards the end of this talk. So when we think about Uranus anywhere, we're always going to be taking a more elevated, higher perspective. So that means the archetype we're working with, we want to also consider what's the status quo, right? What's the norm for Uranus, for Taurus second house in general? So let's think about that. We have the idea of survival. Okay, you eat food. Yeah, generally you eat food, you wear clothing, you need to make money, and you need a house. Okay, so all of those things from a Uranian point of view, we have to step a little bit further back, because we have to say, what is money? What's its function? What's clothing for? What are houses? And so all of these areas that correspond to how we live, and on a deeper level, how we embody the vest of life, the vestfulness. There's a word that I'm looking for. Vitality. I don't know, the vitality of life itself.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right, we're wanting to access a more essential experience that's not bound by the conditioning. And so the intention with Uranus and Taurus is to liberate from constructs of survival and relationship to this one sensual reality, one sensual experience that suppresses the soul's inherent nature, the inherent individuality. There are people out there who are, in terms of music and grace, right? Sound, music, song, that's Taurus second house. It's one of the most powerful Taurus second house expressions, because when you sing, you're literally using your whole body and creating. Think about this. You can't sing while you're in a state of fear, survival fear. Like song is life. And you can bring song into any state. You can be in survival fear, but then meet that sensation and make it art. Like song is in my experience, in my reflection on this, song is the most imminent and direct way of saying, I am here now. Because you're literally meeting the energy of the moment with your body. And it's a practice or a way of actually feeling what's here. And so to every song elicits different feelings too. Every song is its own experience, its own sensual experience. And song can be applied into any state. And so there's a way for life to be experienced as a song, which is another way of saying it's a way of not grasping at our sensory experience, which is, oh, I don't like the way this feels. I'm going to tighten up. When we tighten up, we're not living. We're not relaxed. We're not receptive.
When you're singing, sorry, Ari, when you're singing, you're open.
Mm-hmm.
And like everything's open, everything's softening. Your emotions are absolutely softening, and you feel much more receptive to those higher energies.
Yeah.
You know, and you feel connected to who you're singing with. You know, the music is really like a portal in a sense. Like kirtan music is like a portal.
Mm-hmm.
It's like inviting all the, sorry.
No, please. That really also further speaks to the power of that sextile between the 12th house and the second house that you spoke to. It's a way inside, which can be a way of connecting with God.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I wanted to mention with Venus Uranus in Taurus, or Uranus in the second house. Back to the survival, there's something I wanted to mention earlier. Oftentimes, you can see like this being a monk's signature as well. And monks do chant. So people renouncing all possessions, right? To live in the ashram or, the monastery, living with nothing except for the shirt on their back, right? Their prayer beads, etc. So it can be, we talk about survival, we talk about money and what we need to survive. It can also be the other extreme. Uranus is the archetype of extreme, and it can, through the trying to Libra, we can renounce all outer attachments and only going to the ashram or the monastery. And there's reasons why people go there. They may have an outer experience in their life that makes them have to do nothing with that life. And so it will send them through a Uranian experience to the ashram, to the monastery. But yeah, there's chanting throughout history in religious ways and in spiritual ways. And, whether you're working on the farm or whatever, it helps you get through the day.
It's also a sign of the extent to which a culture has integrated song and dance and art in general really reflects their relationship to life and their values. Right? It's like Western culture in general. It's not so connected to that. I think that's beginning to change, but it hasn't really been so connected as in comparison to more indigenous cultures in general, or even Eastern. And that reflects a certain way of relating to life, where it's more like hard survival way of being. I imagine this made-up story of this person that doesn't have a home, in the conventional sense, at least, right? But they're happy. They enjoy the breeze of the air, the sound of the wind. All they need is a little bit of food every day, and they share what they have. Versus someone that maybe has a lot of stuff, but they're not happy. They have things, they have money, they have lots of food, but filling the senses isn't necessarily the path. So there can be this deep retreat and withdrawal with Uranus in the second house from conditioned notions and ways of surviving and living here. It's like you mentioned, the monastery or the ashram, it's a retreat from a more status quo way of living where we are really stepping back and observing the physical reality of our life. What do I need to survive? Well, it depends on what I value. And if we're really seeking to access our essential nature, we're going to find ourselves disidentified with the values that maybe the world appreciates. The house, the car, the computer, the food, the clothing, the styles. And there can be this profound simplicity and thus a higher intelligence that one access. So there are a lot of people, coming back to the idea of song, with Uranus in the second house, there are so many examples of singers that are accessing song as a way of them living their life and embracing the artfulness and the beauty of their life as their own being. You can, and we'll give an example of this. It's a very perfect example for this. That's very well known, but it's an incredibly common musician signature. We could also have an example of someone that says, you know what does the body need to survive? Well, I don't really need anything. I'm just going to feast on the sunlight. There are all kinds of ways of being here as a human being. And with Uranus, we access and connect with the archetypal nature of reality. And we're living in less density. Like, we're not living as much in this constricted construct of crystallized forms and rules and definitions that says this is what it means to be a human being. We begin to access the idea that all of life is really a matter of resonance and vibration and harmonics. And so we can begin to access that. We start to appreciate that how we live, there's much more joy and beauty and value and meaning if the way that we live is resonant with essential vibrations, universal archetypes. So it doesn't take up as much space. We feel like we're accessing something that's universal, that's not actually binding us to some sort of subjective human experience. And that's the intention. That's the transformation with Uranus in the second house, to liberate from survival and thus to elevate our ideas of it. This also can be applied to ideas of sexuality, how we are in relationship to pleasure to our bodies. Now, the world has an idea of pleasure. The world has judgments and constructs around how and where and in what ways pleasure is okay, in what ways sexuality is okay. But sexuality from a higher perspective can be understood as a technology, as an intelligence, and to understand the technology of the body and the senses and to work with it and to elevate it to a higher level of consciousness. And so in that sense, there can be a sort of distaste. Like, oh, I don't like the way humans do sex or how humans do pleasure. It's so unconscious and base. That can be one dynamic with Uranus and Taurus or the second house, because the intention is to elevate. What is a way of relating to the senses with appreciation of the body? Kind of like Yogi Bhajan says that, this is not an exact quote, but there's a teaching he offered once of, we can access the cosmos if we attune our body correctly, by attuning our consciousness. So a lot of the Kundalini Kriyas, as I understand it, are oriented towards bringing us into vibrational alignment. It's a way of working with the body as a cosmic resonator, as opposed to just like a piece of meat that you got to like take care of. Within that, we also want to speak to the idea of trauma as it relates to Uranus in the second house. So there can be trauma to the senses, to the body, to sexuality, that then leads us all to dissociate from their sensual experience, right? So we can have an experience where it's not about liberation or taking a step back from the mainstream and finding a more individuated way of being. It can be, I'm not feeling anything, right? I've had to numb out or dissociate to survive. So a lot of souls with Taurus or second house Uranus have a particular past, Uranus again speaking to the total memories of the soul, that aren't necessarily conscious or remembered, but the imprint is there, where there is trauma to the body. This could be trauma to land. Jeffrey Wolf Green taught that Uranus corresponds to dehydration. And I've seen it many, many times. Clients that have had memories of past lives where they were on a farm and all of the land was burned, right? Or something happened and devastated all of their crops. Different experiences where the sources of survival were traumatized, and thus they experience a total disconnect from what they experience as survival. Or sexual trauma, where in order to survive, they had to kind of shut down and disconnect, dissociate. And so then survival can be associated with all kinds of traumatic experiences linked to loss or persecution. Wherever we have Uranus is where we can find the mainstream persecuting those that don't fit into the mainstream. So subdivisions of society, which could be groups of people, races, or different cultures within society that are persecuted because they're the minority, Uranus. They're outside of the norm relative to the mainstream idea of what norm is. And so then this can lead souls to, living certain lives where they're in isolation, or maybe they're living a very unique or different life, but there's a sort of fear of living. There's a fear of enjoyment. There's a fear of actually connecting with survival, with land, because of a lot of paranoia or trauma, or a shutdown, coldness, disconnect relative to the sexual body. And these are areas where there's a journey of healing and liberation that can happen, where the soul, as per old trauma, works through the trauma as an observer, and then is able to unleash and awaken their inherent soul individuality, which means in this case, the capacity to live, but to live from a free place, not a place that's been traumatized. Anything you want to add to this before we move on?
Well, for sure, it is absolutely going to be some trauma to their own sensual experience, like a disconnect from their body. Like whenever they were in a place where they were naturally expressing their individual desires or sensuality, potentially, and this isn't going to be every single soul with a signature, but there was some kind of traumatic experience that would have happened. So when you disconnect with yourself physically, you are disconnecting with yourself emotionally. They typically will go, the trauma is a disconnect from your emotional body, a direct effect, because that's how you survive. By being in your emotional body, there's a fear of reliving the trauma again. So, it can be a bare bones kind of reality where, they're just going to keep themselves distanced from having to reaccess those memories. Who wants to go to the polarity? Then you got to go into all of those experiences again and all of those memories. And so, wow, I mean, it can be a hard cycle to break, depending on what the total signature is. And this isn't for everybody, like I said, but when it is directly linked to trauma, also I would say too that it could be like tribe trauma, where you're the one left holding the bag, or you're one of the soul survivors,
Right.
And you've witnessed and watched your whole tribe perish. How do you move on after that? How do you even function? You just become frozen in like a catatonic state, really. So there's a myriad of examples where in order to survive, they have to disconnect from certain emotions or even physical needs. It's just bare bones. Yeah.
The disconnection is fundamentally from the feeling body, because to feel would bring back the very places where there has been trauma in the past. And so there can be this orientation of just numbing out through life. And then things like money and job and even sexuality can feel uninteresting. Like, okay, I'm living this life, but this isn't me. And this is a very common Uranian experience. It's like, I don't feel connected to the things that I'm doing. It's because this isn't you. And there's something beyond the traumatized dissociation. And it's important to mention. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go for
I
it.
was just going to say, even intimately or sexually speaking, someone who's with them intimately can feel like everything is separate, right? Or the person who has Uranus in the second, it's almost like they're watching themselves in the act, right? Or watching themselves, but it's not really them. It's like they're watching themselves like they're watching a movie,
Right.
because they're so disconnected. They're just performing the function.
Yeah.
that
Yep.
they're not actually emotionally and physically in their body in a way that they can feel it.
Yeah. It points to such a fascinating facet of the Uranus archetype, which is the nature of observer. Because to
Observer.
observe a person having to observe oneself having a sensual experience while having that experience, be it sexuality or eating something or whatever, itself points to the nature of our true self. It itself points to the very nature of the soul, our free consciousness, who we actually are, as being separate from the human experience itself. Like our identity, our true nature fundamentally stands apart and is witnessing the human experience. So these are all areas where there's the potential for a profound realization, a profound liberation, where we actually disidentify from the senses, and thus we inhabit a life that can reflect a greater level of intelligence that reflects our own soul nature, our own individuality. And we're not just trying to fit in with the way everyone else or the status quo of our life as it was before. One more thing to speak to is Uranus always corresponds to groups, community, and just the principles of giving and inclusion and sharing. So Uranus in the second house can speak to souls that come from communities where resources are shared, like a higher, more intelligent way of living where we understand it's not about me and mine and my stuff and you and your stuff. There's a way of living here in bodies on the earth from a higher understanding, a higher intelligence that says, if we can think about sharing and the fact that like we're all here together, there must be a more a better way of living where we consider all of each other. We consider one another. We consider people of all environments, people from all communities, people of all subdivisions of society, people that aren't in the mainstream. We consider the environment. We consider the earth. The more considerate we are of more, the more we recognize that we're all sharing this earth, we're all sharing these resources, that there's no possession doesn't exist. From a Uranian perspective, that is not a thing. Possession is a relative time, space, Saturn dimension, I guess you can say. In terms of like the nature of reality itself, possession doesn't exist. And so to understand survival and human needs from a more universal, collective, communal point of view means we appreciate that we all do better and we all survive better when we think of systems of living that takes into account the whole. And, you know, a basic example of that would be a person that grows food on their front lawn and says, well, the food that I'm growing is enough to feed everyone on my block. You know, and then that starts an ecosystem that starts a way of being, a human trend where people grow food and share. And now all of a sudden you don't have to buy food from the market. Now what you're doing is you're liberating from a whole system of commodification and use of resources, which is what's perpetuated by buying food that is shipped, you know, across states in a big truck that uses fossil fuels, and the kind of destruction that happens to the earth and the creating all of these things. So there are so many ways to live if we just think about we and us. And it's always going to be more exciting and more interesting, and it's going to feel like, oh, this is so much more natural, so much more right. And we won't go into this rabbit hole, but a great example of all of this, maybe we'll loop back at when we touch upon Uranus and the North Node, is cryptocurrency. Fascinating stuff. And one thing that's profound about it is you can trade cryptocurrencies and even buy houses with it and be completely free of government regulation, right? If it's not converted into, you know, US dollar in the States, for example, then it won't be subject to tax. So as long as you keep everything within the crypto realm, you can do all kinds of transactions, and that's a little more essential. That's a little more aligned with universal, you know, here you want something, great, here I want this. There's so much evolution happening. Also, like all things Uranus, there tends to be this threshold where we're evolving, where we're growing, and there's going to be a small group of people that see a new potential, a new way, and no one else is going to understand it. It's like no one understands how computer works or how internet works, but eventually it's worked its way into the mainstream. Things like alternative cryptocurrencies, very few people actually understand the technology itself, but it's eventually going to make its way more and more into the mainstream. And that's how it always goes.
That's a
Okay.
very Uranus in the second house. Uranus and Taurus.
It's yeah.
Oh wow, that's a perfect example. All right, let's start with our first chart.
Okay, let's do it. So let's start with Pablo Picasso. I really enjoyed learning about this guy. It's super inspiring, fascinating creature. So he has Uranus in Virgo in the second house. It is separating from a square to the nodes, which means this is an issue that he has already been integrating and is pretty well developed prior to this life, and is meant to continue to be integrating and working that out. With Uranus and Virgo in the second house, it's obviously going to speak to a very strong, meticulous, self-focused, detailed orientation to the art, to survival, to the senses, to the sensual experience. The very nature of the soul is actually a Pluto in Taurus retrograde in the 11th house, with the South Node itself in Gemini in the 11th. This is all about, Gemini in the 11th is about a perceptual renaissance, looking at things, creating logical premises for how to put reality together in a new way, stepping aside from the mainstream mental constructs and looking at things differently, and thus creating a whole new syntax for understanding reality. And bottom line, Pluto and Taurus in the 11th house, this soul's own evolutionary journey was to be a group of one, to know his own values, to be himself, and to live a life that reflects his own soul individuality, and to feel content and whole and complete within that. The North Node being in Sag in the 5th, just lived a life, wild, spontaneous, ever-evolving creativity, right? So with this Uranus in Virgo in the second house, the intention here is for this soul to continue to liberate. There are a couple dimensions to this. The first is to liberate and free up from the perfectionism of form, the perfectionism of survival, which otherwise can become a tedious, monotonous, boring, and almost like self-flagellating harshness. So a big part of his own, and I would say that there's probably been in his past an intense amount of rigorous training. And I see this chart and I think about like a Renaissance painter, like rigorous discipline and training, meticulous, working with the, right? But what's this about? It's like, okay, I've done that. I want to live and just like use all the skills, but to experience life in a new way that brings me into the present moment. I watched a short video of his this morning where he was recorded painting a picture live. And the picture was brilliant. He just drew a picture that started off as like, I don't remember what the images were, but it was like a bird, a face, something else. Each image in live time became one thing and another thing and another thing. And it was just Sag, all intuitive, all spontaneous. But we could also feel he's exploring something in that present moment. It's almost like he's working on a much higher level of consciousness. And his soul journey, when he was early, he was painting what we can say would look like very good, normal pictures, but very, very skilled, very, he was a prodigy as a child. As he grew older, he became more and more interested in these different ways of seeing and experimenting. There was a need to constantly liberate. So these quotes to me really, and I put the two in green. The chief enemy of creativity is good sense. I love that. And that really just speaks to that nodal square with Uranus in Virgo in the second house. He didn't want good sense. He wanted creativity. Ah, good taste. What a dreadful thing. Taste is the enemy of creativeness. And it took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child, freeing the mind. Okay, so this is not just painting. This is how he lived. I love this quote too. I like to live as a poor man with lots of money. not defining himself according to his wealth. I mean, so even just the picture, painting shirtless right here, right? It's like, what did he have? What did he need? What did he value? He valued the wild and the creative life, using his skills, right, in a way to access, and these are just my words, not his, in a way to access a more essential, freed up experience of life. That's my sense from him. Inspiration exists, but it has to find you working. I love that. Every child is an artist. The problem is how to remain an artist once he grows up. Learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. And that, I like that a lot. I mean, that just feels really, really good with that Uranus in Virgo in the second house. Rules, of course, being Saturn. It trines all of that Taurus in the 10th house. But to have all that skill and that meticulousness, but to not be grabbing it or possessing it. So I think he's a great example of Uranus in the second house to really understand an individuated soul, right? An individuated soul who has stepped apart from mainstream ways of living and surviving. Now, a Uranian thing is we're often going to find ourselves associating with groups of people that resonate with our level of intelligence. So avant-garde, other artists, people that resonate with that level. So collaborations with other artists and people that resonated with him. Of course, that was a big part of his life as well. We're always going to find community in ways that reflects our vibration, the way in which we're resonating with life. Sometimes we'll also find ourselves completely alone, not resonating with others. And that's a part of the Uranian experience of freeing ourselves from precedent and individuating and finding out what we are when we're not trying to fit in. All right. So anything you want to add to this?
I remember reading at one point in time that they described his art as cubism.
Yeah, that was a style that he created with some other artist.
Okay. Was there an explanation to? I mean, it does look like a bunch of separate images a lot in his art, but
if you can pull up cubism and read the definition of that, that would probably tell us a lot. Yeah, I can do it right now.
well, it's just talking about. Go ahead and you find it because it was just talking about the invention of cubism and
they brought different views of subjects, usually objects or figures, together in the same picture, resulting in paintings that appear fragmented and abstracted. Okay. So that's the idea of cubism, invented by Picasso and Georges Barak. So that to me resonates very much as well with that Mercury, with that Gemini. Like you can look at a picture and say, oh, here's the arm, here's a leg, here's a nose. Right. Cubism is taking it, just putting it together in completely different ways. So it's working around the conditioned patterns of the mind.
Yeah. Things don't necessarily fit. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. That was great. Thanks, Ari. I love that. So we decided we wanted to share a chart of somebody who's not famous, who has Uranus in the second house. And while it can just be phenomenal when you look at somebody's unique gifts and individuality, this is a story really of heartbreak. Uranus can really reflect that in someone's chart if they're coming into this life with post-traumatic stress from any kind of trauma, heartbreak, sudden accidents, sudden endings, shocks and surprises. I mean, I think we've all experienced that in one way or another in our life. But this is a tough one because if you look, we think of, well, we know that Venus rules Taurus and it also rules the sign of Libra. So not only is it our inner relationship to ourselves, but our relationship to others. And this Venus is in the 7th house in Aquarius, which is ruled by Uranus. And Aquarius can connect to a soul who is frozen, not connected to their emotional body. And then the question becomes why? With a south node in the 5th house in Scorpio and Pluto conjunct that Uranus retrograde in the 2nd, this is a story of a soul who watched their partner be tortured in another life, and witnessed a lot of heartbreak in relationship, also because of not being able to be emotionally available. And if you are a big follower of this work and study the different aspects of EA, skip steps is a really important thing to address when you're looking at a chart, which is a planet that's squaring the nodes. And this Venus, which is a Taurus ruled planet, is squaring the nodes, but it's moving into the square, 10 degrees. So the soul has really been stuck at this point, unable to actually move forward because of the trauma from the past. And so one expression that comes to me when I see this is, I will never love again.
Mm-hmm.
Because, anytime you let your guard down, Pluto and Uranus are opposing the Saturn in Pisces. It's like getting caught for something you weren't supposed to be doing. It's possible that this soul was, caught with somebody who was in the same, it was like a relationship where it was same gender, and being caught with in a circumstance where that wasn't, okay at that time. So anyway, this is a tricky one, because that Venus rules the North Node in Taurus, but that's where the soul is trying to go. Also, the polarity point of Pluto in the 8th. But we have to deal with this resolution, the skip step, before the soul can really embrace the polarity of Pluto or embrace the North Node. And they're all working at once, but this has to be addressed. And it really does come down to why. The soul has got to be objective and ask, why am I this way? Why can't I not cry? He has like really one or two memories of his life ever being able to cry. Why can't I access that emotion? And then the pressure and the stress of that. And so now look at the transits right now in this chart. So Saturn's sitting on that Venus, and Uranus is approaching the square there. So, but throughout this life, the soul has experienced some shocks, intentionally, to try and throw them back into the emotional body. We have to re-enter the fracture in order to heal it, is what I shared in that first, or maybe it was the introduction of the Uranus series that we're doing. We have to re-enter it, and we will re-enter it over and over through these transits until we can resolve what that was all about. And so, like you said earlier, Ari, this is a fear of this soul with a very, I would say, open sexuality. It would be open to anything if you loved that soul, right? So more open. And with the second house, Uranus there, there can be consequences for exploring something that wasn't acceptable at that time, etc. And so as a result in this life, it's, doing anything possible to just appear normal, to not attract attention. But then when we do that, when we don't allow our walls to be down and we don't allow ourselves to be open and to be experiencing ourselves in relationship with pure emotion, then all of that repression becomes distorted, and it can feel like there's no emotional connection here. So this is, there can be compassion from that person. You can perceive them as compassionate, but it's very different than being emotionally vulnerable in a relationship. If you can see too here that Saturn in Pisces conditions every other planet in the chart. It's ruled by Neptune in Scorpio in the 4th, and it's retrograde. So there's an emotional arrestment here, and it's preventing the soul from evolving. And this soul is very much an individuated state. And so, but it is going to be really important to address this Venus in this life in order for movement to happen. And that second house Taurus, like you said, anything that doesn't feel good, right? The soul doesn't want to do. There can be even a laziness. Laziness is actually probably not the right word here, because nobody likes to re-experience trauma. We'll just I mean, who wants to do that? Nobody wants to feel insecure. Nobody wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And then when it finally happens, sometimes we can feel powerless and helpless in our pursuit of trying to understand why this could happen, or why it happened, and what if it happens again. This fear of being out of control or not knowing where something's headed, I mean, it can absolutely create a state of frozen paralysis emotionally. So this is a pretty extreme case with Uranus in the second there, exactly conjunct Virgo. I mean, Pluto in Virgo retrograde. It's compounded. The retrograde reflects, the double retrograde there reflects, and the Neptune retrograde, which is the ruler of that Saturn, reflects lifetimes of just not being able to move forward along these lines.
So another piece that also emerges for me, this is interesting, seeing another Uranus and Virgo in the second house. Probably a whole Uranus cycle after Picasso, a whole 84 years or so.
Oh, wow. Yep.
There's so much here around the Judeo-Christian distaste or judgment or fear of impure forms or expressions of sexuality, where we can also see in this chart with that Uranus in conjunct to Venus in Aquarius, which is then square in the nodes, where there's been essential experiences of rejection, throwing the soul back upon itself. It's almost like having a very strong sexual or nature and getting the reaction, getting the projections from others. You're dirty, you're bad, you're evil, this is not good. And opposing all that Pisces in the 8th house, which is ruled by that Neptune. So much of this speaks to the patriarchal persecution of the feminine and more natural forms of sexuality, since we come back to that Neptune and Scorpio on the South Node, Neptune being in the 4th house. So it feels like so much of this chart really constellates around this soul reconnecting with their own life, their own creative expressions. I'm just curious, like, are they an artist? Are they open to sharing? Like, are they an artist? Do they do any kind of where's the creative outlet for them?
Definitely artistic, for sure. And I gave this example earlier. I can absolutely see this, though. After one or two, or who knows how many lifetimes, I don't have that kind of brain, but this is absolutely a soul who's gone to the monastery after that heartbreak. Like, where else do you go?
Right. It feels so, yeah.
I mean, there's going to God, or attempting to go somewhere to get answers has been also a theme in this chart. And you can see that through Neptune on the South Node there in Scorpio, ruled by Pluto conjunct that Uranus retrograde opposing Saturn and Pisces. It's all right there. It's in that completely. And so just completely wanting to be held by something, an energy that accepted him, like this unconditional love, just searching for it. But the thing is that when you're traumatized, like you said, when you're traumatized, you can't sing. When you're traumatized, you can't necessarily feel the emotional connection to God, right? If you're just sitting there just shaking from whatever might have occurred. I mean, some things, some souls, it can feel like they can never get over it. But it at some point they will. I mean, over time, they will. And it all comes down to objectifying, why did my soul create this in the first place? That's what it comes down to. Part of it can be living during times that are so patriarchal, you have no shot in heck, just to be yourself without some horrible thing happening.
Yeah.
So that, was a big part of it. Yeah. So I just wanted to give kind of an example of someone just like you and me, living life. We're not famous, or, we're not Picasso or the president, but someone who's actually working on this second house Uranus.
And just as a teaching for everyone, with the resolution node being the South Node, which is ruled by Pluto, which is conjunct Uranus, it really speaks to a situation where they're needing to reconnect with that place where there's been that trauma in the past, but in a way that is not in the Scorpio darkness or shadow. So here there can be that fear of being seen, fear of opening up, fear of fully expressing and fully sharing oneself. Learning to do that while remaining stable and sort of detached. Taurus 11th house, not concerned with how are other people going to respond. Am I going to be rejected? So I think there's something potent here around their work in sharing and even like seeing other people in a very radical and real way. I see it, the chart of a creative psychosomatic counselor, therapist,
Oh my
leader.
gosh, like he would be amazing at helping people who are traumatized. In fact, people do reach out to him all the time. He said for this, I mean, he gets called when people are literally, wanting to take their life and like really extreme situations.
Because he can
And he
care and
doesn't do it.
feel deeply.
He doesn't do that work remotely in his life. So,
Yeah.
but people call him for that. And like he's got this natural capacity, and calm, steady demeanor, like just that will help people rethink what they're doing, and yet not so much that same ability within his own self, but so good with others that way.
Such a common Uranian thing is,
Yeah.
I have this one friend, she's a cranial sacral therapist. She's an Aquarius, very strong Uranus signatures. So calm, so relaxed. Being around her, my whole nervous system, when she touches my
Yeah.
feet, everything is so relaxing. And she's been through immense mental trauma. The two often come together. The ability to kind of stay cool in the midst of chaos is almost like a strategy that's learned. It's a very common survival technique, but it also can point to a state of liberation where the soul has really freed themselves up and they're able to stay as an observer. And that's where a greater sensing capacity comes in.
Mhm. I wanted to share one more thing about that second house. I agree with you. I have a brother who has moon in the second. And when I was 12, 13, something like that, um, every time my parents would leave, go out to dinner, go out with friends, I would be in total stress thinking something was going to happen to them. And they were my parents in my last life, and something happened suddenly. They were killed in front of me in my most recent past life at that age. I didn't know that till later, but
Wow.
anyway, and so for a couple of years, I mean, I literally would lay in bed and shake for like 3 hours until I heard the garage door open. And my brother would say, I don't really worry. If they were 5 minutes late, I would just be in a total panic. And it went away after that age. But my
Right.
brother with the moon in the second, one of them would say, I don't worry about things until there's a reason to worry about them, until it's actually happened. Like and it was just that way. He's still that way. So he was a calming force for sure under crises or stress in my family growing up for everybody. So it's a definitely a definite attribute, I would say. All right, let's move to the next one.
John Lennon. All right. Best example ever. Musician, Uranus in Taurus in the second house. That's a Venusian ruled Uranus, which is ruled by Venus in Virgo in the fifth house. He was actually really critical of his own music. Pretty harsh on himself if you get to know just his own reflections on a lot of his own creations. But this is a soul that was just completely content in living his own world. Had that sort of cool vibe and wanted to be a musician from early on, wanted to just immerse himself in rock and roll, in creating music. And this is fundamentally a soul that was internally withdrawn from the status quo, from the mainstream of society. And anything that became a crystallized form was no longer tasteful for him, right? Just it became, you make music, you perform, status quo, mundanity. He didn't resonate with fitting into another, even the group you have to liberate from at a certain point. There is something about his soul that was constantly seeking to move into a more liberated state. Now, there's something very interesting about this dynamic because on the one hand, Uranus anywhere can be like avant-garde or higher class or the upper echelon of society. And I would say this is a thing that his soul has experienced before the life of John Lennon. And then being a Beatle, he's practically the most famous person in the world. And a part of the ongoing journey of his own evolution was to actually not keep himself separate. Like he was almost fed up. And this is my interpretation. He was almost fed up with his own upper echelonness, his own higher classness, his own specialness. And towards the latter part of his life, he got a lot out of just living a normal life, raising his child, trying to just be someone, not hidden in all of these glamorous fame and fortune, I'm a famous person constructs, but just living a life that was normal. There's this one experience where a woman saw him on the street and noticed who he was, and he put a finger to her mouth and said, shh. He just wanted to walk down the street, and he's like Aquarius moon in the 10th house. Like fundamentally, he's wanting to liberate from the constructs of separation and class separation and wealth separation. So he became very, oriented towards activism. Of course, his activism was staying in bed, for a while with Yoko Ono. That was his activism for peace. That couldn't be more Uranus and Taurus in the 2nd house. I'm going to be an activist by just being comfortable and staying in bed. And of course, his music, on the most basic level, his music was freaking revolutionary, right? Like, what he brought forward was always pushing the status quo, whether it's music or what you value, what's important, what's meaningful or valuable about life. But to look at the music that he brought forward, he, along with the Beatles, revolutionized music. And, many people would consider John Lennon as sort of like the leader of the Beatles. They're all really equally important, but there's a certain vibe to John Lennon that just had its own authority, had its own command. And you pointed out actually that the Beatles, they all had a composite. 2 of them had Uranus and Gemini, but they all had a composite Uranus Saturn in Taurus in the 6th, trining the North Node and Neptune in Virgo in the 9th, which is world fame, right? Mm-hmm. Neptune in the 9th. And it's also really working on creating a craft, an art that was completely new and revolutionary. And so just he embodied that Uranus and Taurus 2nd house quality so strongly. Every phase of the Beatles' career was something completely new. And a lot of these ideas came through, let's experiment with a different way of playing with music, playing the track backwards, working with loopers, ways of creating sound that came from more inventive, freed up mind that was never done before. So it's him and the Beatles really contributed immensely to a complete revolution in music. And when we think about a revolution in music, it's not just like, okay, this is a new kind of music. It fundamentally speaks to a shift in consciousness. The music that we listen to, the sounds that we're hearing, the rhythms that we're hearing, everything elicits and opens up a different state of consciousness. And so their experimentations with consciousness, with psychedelic substances and meditation, and just a more open-minded way of thinking of life, brought forth a completely new experience of sensual reality. And things like Uranus will always point to social, Jeff Green associated with the idea of a social contagion. So something opens up in one part of the world, and it's like happening everywhere at the same time. So what the Beatles brought forward, and what we can say was embodied through John Lennon's creative expressions, reflected a complete collective renaissance. There was an awakening in consciousness, in music, in art, in how we're embodying everywhere around the world. And the Beatles very much exemplified and embodied that collective awakening. Anything you want to add to this?
Sorry, my background noise here. Well, gosh, I mean, I want to go to the composite chart again. I mean, everything is written in the stars, everything you want to know. I mean, this is just an unbelievable composite chart when I was discovering this. And on top of the fact that Uranus and Taurus is actually balsamic to Saturn, trining the North Node, Neptune, and Mars. That is absolutely world fame. The 9th house being an international house and world fame, that Neptune right there, conjunct the Mars. But Jupiter and Venus are also conjunct. Venus rules Taurus. And to have them in a new phase like that with Jupiter, just awesome. It's massive. In Gemini, it was like, everybody knows the lyrics to all their songs, the whole
Mm-hmm.
world singing them at the same time. They're feeling good because of it. Let It Be, Here Comes the Sun, Imagine, all the people. All the songs that we know,
Mm-hmm.
and countless others. So uh, I would say like their music just, if you think about the North Node, Neptune, Mars, trining Uranus and Saturn, it had a way of healing the hard stuff. The music does have a way of doing that. Changing your perspective, that's Uranus. And just, you're not alone. We're all feeling this, we're feeling you, we're feeling this. And so they definitely had a way of reaching everybody, every single body.
I want to correct one thing because I don't like him. I wouldn't say he was the leader of the Beatles. In fact, I would say there was a soul lesson for him to get out of his own arrogance or
Mm.
self-importance. So Uranus and Taurus in the second house is also can speak to lessons of sharing and inclusion. And most people would agree that he was the cause of the Beatles breaking up, him leaving. And Paul really didn't want to break up the Beatles. So Uranus is community, is a group. Here you're in a musical band, Uranus and Taurus in the second house. And so there's a lot of lessons around inclusion, but also at the same time, the draw of the soul to continue to liberate and wake up and not be defined by any particular construct or group.
So did he break them up over a girl?
I don't know enough to say, but I
I think
do
so.
know
I think that Yoko was a big part of that.
I think Yoko had a big influence on that.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
And he was very much influenced by Yoko. But it was his choice to leave that I think, and I watched most of the Beatles documentary on Disney Plus, which is freaking amazing. I think it was his choice to leave that broke it up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's touch upon this. Mikaela Shiffrin.
Oh, great. Okay, so anybody who's been watching the Olympics right now, Olympic skier, multiple medal world phenom, Mikaela Shiffrin, in the recent Olympics or the Olympics that are currently happening right now. There's 5 potential events for her to compete in. The first 2 were going to be her strongest events, and she missed gates in the first 2 of her strongest events. She literally did not finish, and a really traumatizing thing for her after 14, 15 years of skiing. It made her question everything she talked about. And it's interesting because, when someone comes to me for a reading and they want to know the likelihood of some event coming up, whether it's a court case or, applying for college, the planets don't lie. They just don't lie. And when you're looking at this chart, Uranus is squaring her moon on, and basically T-square her moon, Mars, Venus.
Mm.
Uranus rules her Venus in Aquarius, which can be like this out of balance kind of energy and emotionally out of balance. I know she lost her father, I think in the past recent period of time, year perhaps, is a big part of her life. So she's been through a lot. And she's kind of shocked the world, just like Simone Biles did with not being able to finish her competition in the gymnastics events there. But what it's doing, a lot of people are coming forward on her behalf to just talk about mental health. I mean, what kind of pressure athletes put themselves under, or the world puts them under, frankly. And so I have to say, when I see a transit like this, the writing's on the wall. I mean, I can't imagine really overcoming something like that. Now, she's when I say that, I just mean the energetic odds are really against the soul. So then you have to ask, okay, so why did she create this? All this attention, this negative attention, what is she supposed to be learning from this? Now she's coming back, I think, to race on Friday. What is it today? Wednesday, Thursday. Tomorrow, I think she's going to be racing something down, some sort of downhill race that is not one of her strongest events. And she's doing what's called the combined next week, which includes some of her strongest and slalom events. And so we'll see what happens. But And the fact that she's getting back on the horse, Mars is trining Uranus right now. We don't know a birth time here, so it's hard to say, but Mars is in conjunct her natal Mars. It still looks pretty rough in the next week. So astrologically, these are probably some of the biggest transits she'll have in her life. Because if you invest, all of your meaning, South Node and Taurus she has, into one thing, right, into racing your entire life, and then all of a sudden it feels like it's being taken away from you, or you're not as good as you thought you were, then what? So, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so with that Venus in Aquarius square in the nodes ruling the South Node, so obviously a lot of the identifications have been oriented towards however she has valued her life, and it's clearly required a capacity to stand as an observer, right? And with Venus ruled by Uranus in Capricorn conjunct Neptune, this can be, I'm working very hard and I've learned how to, keep mentally focused and create form and transcend forms and limitations in forms. And, Aquarius, Uranus can be genius. So I can really see the signatures in here really shaping, cultivating craft, the body, the ability to develop a certain skill that allows a soul to transcend the limitations of form. It can be very much crafted as like a higher, more intelligent, crafted perfection, focused, concentrated vibe, but all through the lens of a Venusian Taurus South Node. If all of my value is in that, I've been training, I've been working really hard. What I'm hearing in what you're sharing, and we're also seeing that Pluto moving over that Neptune Uranus at this time. And during this time, there's been so much transiting happening around that Neptune Uranus. It's breaking down the crystallized form that she's been so familiar with, that she's disciplined under. And then relative to that identity construct, it's like, I've only known myself as this. That's what I would see being broken up right now. Especially with all that Leonian, it's like being good at it, winning.
Well, she's Moon, Mars opposing Venus, and those are all her skip steps in this life.
Yep.
So that Venus is the ruler of her South Node, is part of her skip steps. So is Moon, Mars, and so this is going to be big. And Pluto transiting Pluto's coming up to her natal Uranus as well. It will absolutely be a time like with Simone Biles, where she's having to evolve her sense of meaning and not making this mean everything, and that she's more than skiing, and it's a very evolution is very humbling.
Oh, it's so humbling.
It's incredibly humbling.
Incredibly dispassionate when it comes to personal preferences.
Absolutely. One thing I remember Jeffrey teaching us in school is that, and through the transits, that if you have something this big, and this is compelling, I mean, this is like 4 major transits, outer planetary, intense transits at once. You have to have counteracting energies to bring it back into a place where it will allow something to be possible, like to overcome this. I mean, it would be great if she got back on the horse and actually did really well in 1 or 2 events, even one event. Les Simone Biles did one event in the Olympics for her own sense of self, not for anybody else, but just to let all the women and young girls in the world to know that never give up, and men too, and boys. But for her, I think it's going to be, well, we'll see what it is. In terms of counteracting those energies, Uranus is moving into a progressive sextile to her Saturn. It's close enough. It's within reach, 4 degrees, 4-ish degrees. And Jupiter's approaching her Saturn as well. I just don't think they're enough. I mean, I think it's going to, these psychological effects of going through that, and then the insecurity, right, that you feel after, falling or not completing what you think you do best, it's going to take the gods literally to help her pull this off. And I'm not saying it's not possible, but she's going to have to go beyond herself, right? She's going to have to grab a hold of her Pisces sun and reach higher for some kind of, I think, higher assistance. And again, ultimately, it's all about, why is she creating it and what's the goal? And she will, this is something she's recreated from another life.
Do we understand why she's missed those markers? Has she spoken to that?
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Someone asked her and interviewed her, and she's like, I don't know. I think I just slipped. That's what she said. And I mean, look at her. Look at how close to the ground look at her. Who can stay on skis like that in that picture?
Yeah.
People slip all the time. It's amazing what she's been able to pull off over the years.
See, this is a chart
And
that to me speaks so strongly to a soul that has been just focusing on mastering form, almost like a very purely refined. You can feel that regimented quality. It's almost like living as if you're a machine. That can be Venus and
totally.
Aquarius. So it's very pure and refined. There's nothing arbitrary going on, and there can be a breaking down of that.
Yeah. Her mom's her coach. You can see the Mars Moon balsamic,
Uh-huh.
and I
Oh,
think she's
her mom's her coach. Wow.
I think she's pretty tough on her, from what I
Wow.
remember.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
there's just a lot of emotional wrapping with this, and I definitely what I
Mars
would
is
love to see
retrograde too. Yeah.
yes, retrograde in Leo. So there is that need to, with the Mars retrograde, there is a humbling that can happen
Big
at some
time.
point,
Yeah.
right? You're
Yeah.
learning you're not everything, and we can't be the best at anything forever. There is this true humbling that happens, and my hope is that she can have a great race to leave the Olympics and see the higher purpose in all this. And when we are humbled, then we're able to help others, whether it's in her sport or something else at some point in time. So
Yeah.
anyway, the nature of sports, I mean, it's just like life. But
Mm-hmm.
all right.
Great. Well, those are all the charts that we had, but I wanted to just give a moment, if you have a moment, just to speak at least Uranus on the North Node
Yes.
this year. So anything on the North Node is a green light for evolution. And Uranus, which speaks to both our true nature, our undivided self, like who we are as a soul, our essential individuality, also pertains to our individual destiny, who we are in our most individuated form, what we are when we're not suppressing our essential nature. So we can say this is a green light towards our future. With a square to Saturn all year, pretty much, this can be incredibly stressful. It can feel like there are these signals coming from out of nowhere, from our higher mind, from reality, pointing us towards what is in our path, the blossoming of our own awakening. And it can feel scary and stressful because the precedent is Taurus. I'm familiar and comfortable with what I'm comfortable with. And like you said, who likes to feel insecure? The calling is to really connect with joy. Do I feel value and joy and life? Am I relaxed? Uranus and Taurus is the pleasure of being in your genius, the pleasure of living a life where this is what I value. This is what is so relevant for me. And we have to ask ourselves that question, especially with that Saturn square in Aquarius, where there's a sense of disconnect or depression, or just not really feeling content, Taurus, with one's life. There's a calling to look within, go deeper, and be open to listen inside to what is calling us forward. It's really interesting that this chart of the exact conjunction also has Mars moving there. So end of July is a powerful time, really potent time for all of us. We're being called deeper into our potential, to think differently and not to be so satisfied with the status quo. There's a big calling for collective evolution at this time. And this is, as you mentioned, this is just before Saturn and Uranus come to, they don't exact the square, but they get within a degree of a square. It's a very heightened time.
I just find it fascinating. Oh my gosh, look at all the retrogrades. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 retrogrades. And a retrograde symbol reflects the Uranian phenomenon. It's like Aquarius, essentially. So on top of everything else, imagine a child being born around that time. Wow. What are they coming here to do? But I wanted to reiterate that even though it's pretty close to an exact sextile, Pluto and Neptune are moving together there. A constant reminder to go beyond your circumstance, to reach higher, further, walk through the inner door. That's what's going to keep you grounded and centered and connected and all the things that we all want and need to feel. And so it is a time where that's offering support during a really intense time. Jupiter and the sun are trining each other on that day, Ari, too. So
Wow.
anyway, all right. So that is a window of time, but the whole year we're still experiencing Uranus and Taurus in relative square to that Saturn.
All right, well, this completes our class on Uranus, Taurus in the second house. We'll return next month with third house and Gemini.
Thanks, Ari.